Welcome, everyone. I'm Will Fenton, Director of Research and Public Programs at the Library Company of Philadelphia. We are an independent research library founded by Benjamin Franklin, and we've grown in all sorts of interesting ways over the past nearly 300 years. And one of the things that I'm excited to do in my little perch is to highlight sort of hidden collections. And certainly culinary ephemera is something that our guest, William Woys Weaver, could spend many, many hours talking about. And so this is going to give you a first taste with the anticipation that we will do other events in the very near future to sort of continue the conversation. And we're very much hoping that your questions help us to really think through what is most widely held in terms of interest. So this event in particular is born out of a series of blog posts and videos created by Katie Maxwell here on screen. And those blog posts and videos were inspired by a book called 35 Recipes from the Larder Invaded, which was a 1986 to 87 exhibition hosted by HSB and the Library Company. And we're going to get into that. But before we get into that, I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce both of our speakers. So first off, we have Dr. William Woys Weaver, an internationally known food ethnographer and author of 20 books dealing with culinary, history, and heritage seeds. He's the founder of the Roughwood Table, a nonprofit organization devoted to heritage foods from heritage seeds. He served as guest curator for the Library Company's culinary exhibit entitled The Larder Invaded. And Dr. Weaver received his Ph.D. in food ethnography from University College Dublin. He is presently working on a culinary history of Philadelphia and also one on foods in Cyprus. We're just learning now too. Katie Maxwell is the visiting services coordinator at the Library Company of Philadelphia. She holds a BA in art from Gordon College. Her freelance clients have included Lehigh Valley Heritage Museum, the Lehigh Valley Military Arts Council, and Boathouse Pictures.
Military Affairs Council.
Affairs Council, excuse me. All right. Early in our COVID-19 quarantine, that would have been back in mid-March, early April, I know Katie had discovered this recipe book from the Larder Invaded, and she was inspired by those historical recipes, and she began documenting her culinary adventures through a series of blog posts and videos entitled What's Cooking at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And we will be intermittently scattering links to all of those wonderful posts. I think there are at least 9 now. Does that sound right?
Just went up to 11.
Oh my goodness. All right. Yeah. So Katie's been much more prolific than I have. And so we will be scattering out some of those wonderful entries as we progress through this talk. It's going to mainly be a conversation between Katie and Dr. Weaver. But before we get there, I'd like to ask William, do you mind taking just a few minutes to sort of talk to us a little bit about what the Larder Invaded was, where it came from, where its title even came from?
All right, that's a very good question. After I published the Quaker Woman's Cookbook, there was a lot of interest in Philadelphia foods, Quaker foods, and local regional foods. So I was doing brown bag lunches at the Historical Society, in which I would lecture while people brought their own food and would sit around. And it was very family style, very comfortable, and it was a nice way to talk history without having a lot of hot air and what have you. Anyway, this evolved into an idea. Since it was so popular, why not do an exhibit on Philadelphia foods? And what would that entail? Well, it turned out that teams were developed by the Historical Society and on the Library Company side of the wall. And we came up with this idea of doing an exhibit called The Larder Invaded, which is based on a print that was the opening image for the exhibit when you came in. Can Katie hold that up? Or,
yeah,
there you go. It shows a cat and a dog arguing over game. We found out later that this is a knockoff of a Landseer painting that was done in England. But it's more or less represented are going into the larders and digging and actually arguing with each other over what was important. You have to realize in those days, ephemera, the things that people usually throw away but save for some reason or other, was very difficult to catalog, and an awful lot of things were owned by the library company and the historical society that never had even been cataloged because no one knew how to do it. So this was a real effort of invading the larders, you might say, the literary larders, the paper larders of the two organizations. And we didn't think we were going to find much. We found mountains. We have found so much material that we actually had to carefully remove an awful lot of it from the exhibit, simply because we didn't have enough room. It evolved that we created an exhibit that used the space of the Historical Society and the Library Company. So you went into the Historical Society on one side and worked your way through this maze of exhibit cases, all with specialized themes. You came through the wall into the Library Company, and then you went eventually out the door onto the street. So it was really a massive thing. It was the largest exhibit ever mounted on culinary history anywhere. There were several thousand items in the exhibit. People came from all over the country to see it. And I think we had somewhere in the vicinity of 15,000 people who came through it at that point. It really put the Library Company and the Historical Society on the map for a lot of people who didn't even know what these organizations were. So it was good in that respect. It was also good because we were forced, or the staff was forced, to accession things that we found in order to give it a number so that we could put it in the exhibit. And this was a whole interesting process. I don't think, even today, that culinary ephemera has a satisfactory way of being cataloged. There are too many crossovers, but we found dinner invitations from George Washington that had never been cataloged. I mean, on and on and on. So the treasures that emerged out of this effort were really good. And I think it started both organizations to rethink the way they have been housing these materials to make them more available to people. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. And just to sort of signpost this, because I know it's going to come up in your conversation with Katie, there are two forms of documentation of this exhibition. There's a blue book and a purple book.
Yes.
Can I ask you just to sort of unpack the difference between the two?
Okay, the blue book, which I'm holding up, is what we call the catalog. And this more or less explained what was in each of the sections of the exhibit. And then the purple book is called 35 Receipts. Kate, can you hold yours up because mine is bad shape? Yes, there you go. We launched the exhibit on a shoestring, and we realized we needed a couple more shoestrings. So almost halfway through this thing, I was asked, can we do a fundraiser cookbook? And so the little purple book, it was made up of recipes that related to the themes of the exhibit, organized chronologically from very early 1600s right down to the 1930s newspaper recipes. We wanted it to represent a sampling of what was going on in Philadelphia in all levels of society, and also the types of food that was being made here. So that's what that's all about. So the recipes in the purple book are chronologically arranged. The material in the blue book, the catalog, are arranged according to the floor plan of the exhibit and the themes of each segment of the exhibit. Because we had to break it down so people could digest this stuff and make some sense of it.
Excellent. And incidentally, both of these volumes are available at the Library Company. So when we are able to welcome you all back into our actual facilities, please do check these out. I know Katie's found the purple book in particular incredibly useful, and it's inspired so many fantastic blog posts.
Well, they're collector's items.
They are. They are.
Truly.
Yeah,
Until that Philadelphia history book comes out, or the Philadelphia culinary history book, I should say. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Katie. Just a quick note to all of you listening. If as you're listening, there's something that comes up as a question, I encourage you to go ahead and pose it through the Q&A thread. And some folks have already started to do this. You all are fast. But certainly if you see something that you share as a question, you can also upvote it by giving it a little thumbs up. And then that will sort of cue to me when I re-enter in the last 15 minutes or so, which questions sort of hold the widest possible interest. So with that, turning it over to you, Katie.
All right. Well, last fall, we were putting together a little gift shop that was going to take over one of the coat room areas. And I found 35 receipts as well as its companion book. And then later, when Pennsylvania was under its first lockdown order, I, like many others, started almost compulsively cooking and stress baking. And after I made a number of pizzas and dumplings and pies and such, I remembered 35 receipts from the Larder Invaded and managed to get my hands on a digital copy. And so I started cooking my way through the book in no particular order, and also often without the required equipment, but it still worked. Some were more successful than others. One of the earliest recipes that I tried was the pickled red cabbage, which is from 1792 and can be found on page 21 of 35 receipts. I think it came out pretty well. I'm going to share a picture right now in just a second. There you go. So it's all ingredients I could get to pretty easily: red wine vinegar, red cabbage, that sort of thing. And it had sort of a smoky flavor to it. And I found it to be a pretty good condiment. I put it on cheeseburgers, grilled cheese and stuff, and things like that. Although I understand that it was not its intended purpose. So can you tell me about, Dr. Weaver, how this recipe was eaten?
Yes, this comes from Briggs, which was an English cookbook reprinted in Philadelphia with a slight change of title. I think in England it was called The English Art of Cookery, and in the US they called it The American Art of Cookery. They wanted to nationalize it. This book is really a very gender-defined cookbook. It is written by a professional chef, and it was written for hotel cookery. So it was an upper class book, and the contents are very masculine.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of roast meats, in which case you would need some kind of condiment to go with them, and this is one of them. I chose this recipe because it works pretty well, given the sort of vagaries of old recipes. It was served basically as a salad, as that's what was called in the 18th century, sallet. And the cabbage was taken out of the brine or the vinegar, chopped up very fine, and put in a serving dish with olive oil. So it was a bit like red coleslaw, if you will, to go with roast meats and that kind of thing. It's upper class because red cabbage was not really a common thing. We find it in a painting by one of the Peel brothers from 1824. So it had a class status. And on that note, I have in front of me, I'll hold it up, if you can all see it. This is an 18th century pickle dish that is from the same period as the cookbook. And the pickle would have gone in this sort of grape leaf plate on the corners of the table, because everything was laid out symmetrically in those days. So there you've got the recipe, and then you've got how it was served. And with the olive oil, it cuts down on the acidity, which was an important point in that period. Also, the red cabbage as a side dish was very Philadelphia in style. It becomes a catering standard dish. And Eliza Leslie published recipes on how to do it the French way, which is after you pickled it, you, instead of add olive oil, you heat it up with butter and garlic.
Hmm.
So you see, that's also a nice way of eating it. Goes good on hamburgers, by the way.
It sounds good.
Yes.
So how important was pickled food to like the diet in Philadelphia?
Well, I think, are going back today. There's a big revival in pickling foods because A, they're good for us, but that was something that everybody did in the fall, is to put up food, because as you got into the winter, the availability of vegetables was very small. So you're down to cabbages and root vegetables and that kind of thing. So the recipes are very much focused on finding interesting ways to deal with these sort of everyday things like turnips and what have you. So it's very, very important, particularly for winter cookery.
Mhm. So what made you choose this particular pickled recipe?
I chose this because it works well, and I think most people will be able to use it successfully. There are not a lot of question marks.
Mm.
And it's also one of those recipes which is sort of boilerplate, which means you can make it Briggs's way, or you can alter it according to your own personal taste and make all kinds of more interesting nuances. That's what I like about it. It's very flexible.
Yeah, I noticed you included a more modernized version of this recipe alongside the original 1792 recipe. So how did you suit it to modern tastes and abilities?
Good question. I have to look at it.
Oh, I've got it handy here.
Okay.
So,
Well, I know that I cut it the quantities down because
right.
Briggs is doing a recipe for hotel. So he's making enough of it for 50 or 60 people, whereas for home cooking, you don't need that much
Right.
of it. And I made it also because you can, once you've made it, you can keep it all winter if you've got a cool spot for it. So it's very practical in that respect. The question marks in this are, well, what was red wine vinegar like in the 1790s as opposed to today? What was the acidity?
Mhm.
I often find in the 18th century books the addition of spring water to bring the acidity down, because it may have been very, very high.
Mhm.
So I adapted it to what we can find in the marketplace today.
Right.
And that's basically what I did.
And I noticed you did not include in the newer version kosher neel.
Oh, no, that's right. I actually don't know why well, I do know why they put that in that recipe. Cochineal, by the way, for those who don't know, are little beetles from South America, and you crush them and it makes a red dye. It's not toxic, but I don't like eating bugs. So,
yeah, I wouldn't want to eat them either.
I
know
know, but
they're fine and safe, but
the reason I believe is that when you are pickling with cabbage, it can turn very blue-black and ugly. And the cochineal was probably an attempt, perhaps it had something to do with the acidity then of vinegar in that period, to keep the cabbage looking red and more palatable. I didn't find that I needed to do that. And other than red dye number 2, which is outlawed, I mean, let's go natural. That's another thing that I like about this recipe. You don't have to tinker with it.
great. So shall we move forward in time? All right.
Oh, one thing,
yes.
I did notice that I went through the seed catalogs of Bernard McMahon, Philadelphia seedsman in this period, and he had one red cabbage, and the variety was called red pickling cabbage.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. We can tell the whole cabbage story right there.
Yeah.
Start with the seeds and end up with Katie's pickles.
Yeah. All right. Sorry, I just have one more. How accessible were cabbages? Was that something that anyone could get in the 18th century?
Yes, cabbages were available in the Philadelphia market. And there were lots of different kinds. You have to realize that they came in from the country or South Jersey or Spring Garden neighborhood. Back in those days was all kitchen gardens supplying the markets. I think plain everyday white cabbage, common cabbage, was available for everybody, and everybody, no matter who you were, you ate it. The rich, the poor, everybody. The red cabbage was special, and it probably was pricier. How they ever got it to market, or even in those peel paintings where they are picture perfect, without any sign of caterpillar chews or what have you, perhaps that's artistic license on the part of the artist. But this was a cabbage that was always depicted in like Dutch still life paintings among very fine food. So I think the red cabbage was expensive, and you had to be more or less upper middle class or above that to enjoy this. Unless, of course, you live with them and you part of the family, the household servants got to eat it that way. The story is interesting. I think we need to look at diaries and see what kind of mentions we find about this, because that really gives us the social context.
Yeah. Well, it is very attractive cabbage. And on to the next recipe is another aesthetically pleasing one. Blackberry pudding from 1886 can be found on page 67 of 35 receipts. And this one was one of the first recipes that I made, even though I did not have a pudding mold. I just had a bundt pan, which kind of worked, probably not as originally intended. And I chose this recipe because I wasn't sure what was going to make it a pudding, since it has flour and baking powder in it, which is not how modern Americans typically think of pudding, I think. Although it does make Mrs. Cratchit's worries about flour quantities and A Christmas Carol make a bit more sense. So I was wondering what sort of defines this as a pudding?
Well, the original recipe was done in a pudding mold, and it was steam baked. It wasn't, how do I explain it? It was a Victorian pudding, which in those days covered, if you look at pudding recipes, it covers a very broad range of cake-like things, but they're much denser than cakes. They're not light and airy like a sponge cake. And this one is not supposed to be that way. In fact, I'm amazed. I'm looking at your end product, and I'm amazed that you got it to work so well in a bundt pan, because it's supposed to steam bake in its own steam. Now, I have a pudding mold from, see it? I'm holding it up.
Yep.
Got it there. And it's silver, or it's tinned on the inside. The whole trick to the pudding is that this would be filled with your batter and then tightly sealed and then put in boiling water and allowed to steam bake for maybe 2 or 3 hours. That's basically a pudding.
Interesting. Since I didn't have a pudding mold, what I did is I covered my bundt pan with aluminum foil and then put it in my largest stock pot and then put a lid on it. And I ended
Smart move. Smart move.
I ended up steaming it a little longer than the prescribed 3 hours. I spent about 3.5 hours. And then starting after 2.5 hours, I stuck a skewer in it to see how gooey it was. And then when it stopped being gooey is when I pulled it out.
You did absolutely the right thing. These are the kind of workarounds I love to find in the kitchen when you don't have the tools. Now, I have this pudding mold that I just showed you is from John Wanamaker's 1911, when they first opened as a department store, okay? But you can find them in flea markets, although if the tinning's no good, I would not use them, but you can get new ones also on eBay. It's that steam that's important because it creates a very special kind of texture for the pudding. And Boston brown bread is really a pudding, okay? And if you think about that and that texture, that's similar to what we should end up with here. Although the fruit, I think, makes a very nice counterpoint to the cakey part, if you want to put the pudding part of it, the starchy part. All of these Victorian puddings, regardless of how they were done, are to our taste today somewhat heavy. And they were eaten with sauces, even heavier yet. So they've fallen out of fashion because I think we don't like to eat that kind of food. But they were practical because you could make one, and this could last you a week.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And you could have it with tea for breakfast. You could put milk on it in a bowl, give it to the kids when they're they want something to nibble on. We have snack foods today that have sort of replaced all of that. So it had its time and place. It's fun to make the puddings using the elaborate molds, because I have some very elaborate ones, but they're kind of towering infernos of food, because I don't eat any kind of starches anymore, so I don't make puddings for myself. But I don't mind cooking them for other folks.
I noticed this had a texture similar to, like, as you were discussing before, kind of like a quick bread, like cornbread, banana bread, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it also made very good French toast once it got just a little bit stale.
Yes, in fact, I'm glad you mentioned that, because a lot of the puddings were actually intended to be toasted.
Wow.
So because if they've got sugar in them, the toasting is going to caramelize that sugar, and it's going to make the flavor better. So yes, indeed. You're spot on with this.
Oh, good.
Mrs. Goodfellow was, I'm not Mrs. Goodfellow, Rohr, Sarah Tyson Rohr. This is one of her recipes from her cooking school. And she was quite a stickler for this pudding thing. Of course, she also promoted pudding molds and all sorts of things. She was quite an entrepreneur. This is a picture that you see on the screen of Mrs. Rohr. She's there in the center, the lady with the lace and the gold chain. And this is one of her cooking classes, 1884, 1885. She is at the Pennsylvania fairgrounds for the state fair in West Fairmount Park, 1884, 85. And there's my great grandmother in the back row, the tallest girl, third from the left. So we always wondered why she was a good cook. And well, she went to Mrs. Goodfellow's cooking school for 2 years in preparation of getting married, so she wouldn't make any mistakes. She became Chester County's pickle queen, and that's how my grandmother learned from her and how I became into the pickle thing. So it's a long story there, but I have not seen any other pictures of Mrs. Rohr's cooking schools. And so this one is quite rare. It doesn't belong to me, it belongs to cousins. But anyway, there you go.
Yeah.
Oh, well, the other thing that's interesting is that my great grandmother was about 4'6". She was petite, and all these other women are really small. So some of them must be like 4'8", 5'2", something like that. I guess we just don't, we're all so tall today, we forget that Victorians were small. Anyway.
Something else I noticed in this recipe is that it calls for baking powder, and I was wondering how long people had been using baking powder by 1886.
Well, Mrs. Rohr did a baking powder brochure cookbook. So she was using a product, and she was promoting that idea in her recipes. Baking powder evolved gradually. There were leavening agents used in the old days. In the 18th century, they were using potash and Hirschhorn from the deer horn. I don't really like the Hirschhorn because it's a little bit of an ammonia taste to it, but Once they realized they could get refined potash and make it into saleratus, as it was called, which is an alkaline, they could mix it with cream of tartar, and there you go. That is basically baking powder.
And that made it more inexpensive as well than using
Right.
eggs for lift, right?
In the 1850s and 60s, companies in the US started to experiment with making one product, baking powder, that was both of those two chemicals mixed together already. So you didn't have to mix and guess. And baking powders really got their publicity at the centennial in 1876. Several baking powder companies. There was the Pennsylvania Baking Powder Company, several of them anyway. They gave out free samples, which was a brilliant idea. Oh, and little brochure cookbooks, which the library company has some. And this was brilliant because women took this home and they said, oh, this is so much easier. I'm going to use baking powder. So it sort of evolved that way. And it's part of this, as you move into the cook stove, the cast iron stove, the baking powder, biscuits, all of that. It's the industrialization of the kitchen.
So who was making this blackberry pudding recipe? Was it a special occasion dish or was it pretty accessible?
Well, Mrs. Rohrer, if this picture doesn't say it more loudly, was teaching women to cook at home. And so this is domestic cookery. And this is something that could be done very easily on the top of a cast iron cook stove. And so blackberries are in my garden in August. So this was a summer dish. And my great grandmother and my grandmother both made this blackberry pudding, which is probably one reason why I chose it. And they served it with blackberry ice cream.
Oh, that sounds delicious.
It is totally over the top. Oh, and a little blackberry liqueur.
Oh, yeah, that sounds great. I also made the fairy butter topping, which involved some butter, some egg whites, and lots of sugar.
Yes.
I noticed there's no sugar in the blackberry pudding recipe itself, just the topping.
Yes.
And so those really
that was part of its charm, is that it emphasized the fruit. It's what you served with it that brought up, because sugar is a great flavor enhancer. So that fairy butter certainly would do it. Talk about calories.
Oh yeah, that was really an incredible amount of sugar.
Yes.
All right, let's see how we're doing on time. I guess we should probably move forward in time to the final recipe, which is leek soup. You can see the ingredients here: leeks, potatoes, onion, shallot. I also noticed that this is pretty similar to modern recipes. This was also one of my more successful dishes. It was very tasty, sort of light and oniony. I ended up adding just a little bit of hot sauce to it, which I thought went well. Maybe not so historically accurate though. One thing I noticed is that this dish is not made with broth, but water, so it's vegetarian. So could you tell me more about the vegetarian movement?
Oh, yes, this recipe comes from a book by Benjamin Smith Lyman, who was a New Englander who came to Philadelphia and published Vegetarian Diet and Dishes. Philadelphia, well, let me finish his story. He was a mining engineer who went to Japan, brushed up against Japanese Buddhism, vegetarian dishes, fell in love with vegetarianism, became totally anti-carnal, as they call people who ate meat, and then wrote all kinds of essays about vegetarianism, and then did this cookbook, which is actually quite forward-thinking because it's almost mainstream. But the story behind Lynham is that he was not alone. Philadelphia is where vegetarianism started in the United States. The American Vegetarian Society was started here. Lots of vegetarian pamphlets and cookbooks. There were religious groups that were totally vegan, like the Bible Christians. And I think they're now extinct, but their church is still extant. The building is in the Northern Liberties. It's now an apartment building. but the Quakers were involved in vegetarianism in the 18th century. And so this is just a continuation of something that was going on here all along. And I don't think there's anything about this recipe that most people would find offensive, because it's using fresh ingredients
Mhm.
and it emphasizes the taste of the vegetables.
Mhm.
I mean, to me, can it get any better than that? Isn't that what we're all talking about now? Farm fresh, that sort of thing. So this is absolutely spot on in terms of where we are heading today with our cooking. And a lot of his recipes are quite good and would make good home dishes without meat. So
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I didn't miss the meat at all in this recipe.
I don't
I
miss it.
imagine you could make like veggie stock and advance some,
Yes,
quartered onions, that sort of thing, and that would also
yes, absolutely.
enhance the flavor as well. I added a little bit of habanero because that has sort of a floral
Oh,
flavor.
that's perfect. Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah.
See, that's what I like about these simple recipes is you can take uh, a special ingredient like the habanero pepper and just give it a little zip and it's over the top. Yep.
Yeah.
Of course, this could take us into the discussion of heirloom leeks and
Ooh.
heirloom potatoes, all of which they're like apples. They all have different characteristics, and some make better soup than others. But we'll leave that alone because that's a whole nother lecture. But that's why I like this. I happen to love potatoes, even though I'm not supposed to eat them. But so using heirloom potatoes in this recipe is great fun. Use the lumper, for example, the potato that caused the Irish famine. I mean, it's just, there are stories tied up with all of these ingredients, which I think can help make the historical food relate to children. They love the stories.
Yeah. Now, I was wondering how leeks made it over to America and how accessible they were as an ingredient in early Philadelphia.
Leeks were here early on. They were here in, I think William Penn had leeks in his garden.
Oh,
Um, no, they were not an everyday onion. Again, I think they were more of an upper class thing, but they were very Anglo-French in cookery. So there were always leek varieties for sale here. We can find them in the seed lists. Musselburgh leek was very, very popular. And one of the recipes that my great grandmother learned at the Mrs. Rohr's cooking school was creamed leeks. My grandmother grew up on it. So um, there were people who didn't like leeks, and they're not easy to grow in like onions, but
mm,
because they do require they're a little bit labor intensive. But uh, for the leek lovers, no, they were always here. I won't say that um, the average person ate them, but there were paintings and descriptions of a thing known as a soup bunch, which is like a bouquet garni, only it's bigger and it has vegetables in it. I'm going to discuss them in my forthcoming book with Rizzoli on the Roughwood Book of Vegetable Cookery. Um, but leeks inevitably show up in this soup bunch as one of the ingredients to help give this broth. Again, it's a vegetarian broth because you're just using vegetables, maybe a slice of squash, piece of parsnip, whatever, but you can make really flavorful broths that way and then
yeah.
build on it from there. That's the kind of broth you could have used for this.
Hmm. Yeah, I saved the leek tops and for stock in the future, and that turned out pretty well as well.
You are absolutely, you know, you've got an A plus for Mrs. Rohrer because you never threw anything out. I mean, when you're shaving carrots to take the
Right.
skin off, you put that in your stock water.
Yep.
The skin from turnips, all of that you can make vegetable stock with.
Yep. I've
Don't
got
throw it out.
carrots in my freezer right now for that purpose.
Good for you. And that's very healthy, by the way.
Yeah. So I was wondering how often someone would eat this type of soup. Since not everyone could afford leeks all the time, would they save this for a special occasion?
Well, leek soup was common in upper class cooking in Philadelphia. It's caterers were making it. Now, vegetarian leek soup would have been for a very special crowd. I found menus from like 1912, 1916 in there for some vegetarian, what did they call it? Vegetarian cafes. I forget the name of them, but these were actual restaurants that catered to people who ate vegan. And this recipe's on the menu. So, and hey, the other thing about this, it's cheap. It's not expensive. You don't have any cuts of meat to deal with. You have just a handful of vegetables that are not expensive. So I think this kind of rustic soup was a lot more common than we have documented.
Yeah, it was quite tasty as well. Something I was wondering is how vegetarians and non-vegetarians regarded each other in the early 20th century in Philadelphia.
That, we ran into that thing when we were putting together the Larder Invaded, because we had vegetarian material in there, and there were the bio. I mean, it was either it was a love-hate relationship, because the people who were vegan were not liked by the people who ate meat. And the people who ate meat were convinced that if you didn't eat meat, you'd die. So, you would wither, and all kinds of strange things would happen to you. But there were people, like there was this another religious group, I can't remember their name offhand, doesn't matter. Clara Landis was their leader. I mean, she was vegan, but she was even against spices and herbs, because she said that spices and herbs will make us short and dark like Mexicans. I mean, it was talk about a racist a take on this. So there were all kinds of levels of this stuff. Now, look, I'm telling you, when you're dealing with history, you have to look at the bad and the good, because you can't put it under the rug. And there's a lot of racial stereotyping involved in this vegetarian thing. There were a lot of Quakers who were vegetarian, and they were wealthy, so they kind of gave it a panache, if you will, but they were also thought of as weird. But then if you look at the people who belonged to the American Vegetarian Society, I mean, you've got fallaway Roman Catholics, you've got Jews, you've got all kinds of people who, for one reason or another, have embraced vegetarianism. And by the way, in Philadelphia, that also meant anti-alcohol in that period. So there was a lot of temperance involved in this. But now you have to realize there was a vegetarian community in South Jersey in Vineland. Now, that wasn't a religious movement, but it was a dietary movement. And this whole vegetarian market, if you will, in Philadelphia is what got Campbell's Soup Company started, what got the glass jar companies started in New Jersey. We went into that in the Larder Invaded a bit, because John Landis Mason was a vegetarian, and he created the Mason jar so that the vegetarians could have vegetables and fruit over the winter. So you see, this sort of fringe group really affected the glassworks, the canning companies, and so they really affected the mainstream direction of the way food was industrialized in the at least in the Delaware Valley. And so yes, Thompson and Campbell started out as a vegetarian canning company, and then that became Campbell's Soup. Okay, so that story is something we really could explore in a much, for a whole lecture unto itself, because the material is strange. Some of it is a little offensive sometimes when you get into the stereotypes, but it's part of the history.
Yeah, that should definitely be a future lecture.
Well, I'm going to jump back in here because I want to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions. I'm sorry to interrupt this conversation. I was having a great deal of joy listening to this, and also I'm excited about the possibilities for future events. And I want to invite all of you, if you don't have a chance to sort of put this in the question and answer feed or the chat feed, make sure you drop me a line, wfenton@librarycompany.org, and let us know what kind of events you're interested in related to culinary history, because I think all of us are really excited about it. And we want to make sure that we're choosing to do the kinds of events that really speak to your interests. So right now, I'm going to start with some of the questions in the Q&A thread. If you haven't already used it, take a look. Feel free to upvote questions that you share or submit your own. We'll have about 10 minutes or so to get through questions, but I will keep a record of these so that we have them for later review. We have a question from an anonymous attendee that I'm going to try to sort of open up so that both Katie and William can participate in it. It's about the recipes. What was the craziest, the most difficult, and or the funniest recipe that you uncovered? And so for you, William, I would leave that open to Larder Invaded and all of the research that you've done related to it. And for you, Katie, really working through that 35 recipe book.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for me, I think the recipe that I never really was inclined to test was brain dumplings. I just won't go there. I'm sorry.
What kind of brain?
Pig brain.
I'm not sure I'm that bold either.
Yeah, I don't think I can beat that.
The texture is awful.
Yeah, it doesn't sound appetizing. I don't think any of the recipes that I chose turned into disasters or anything, but the most difficult one for me, it might not be difficult for other people, is the stuffed artichokes. I could trim the artichokes, I could cook that wasn't the problem. It was getting the choke out. Because in the recipe, you have to get the choke, like the spiny bit out before you cook it. And I could not, like the recipe said to rinse it, it just made it wet. It did not get it out. So I tried to look up every YouTube video I could find with how to get this thing out of here, and it just wasn't working. I was just destroying my artichokes. And so I eventually got them out, and then I was just so annoyed with them. I barely ate them. My husband, however, devoured his 2 artichokes and finished my 2 artichokes and was just utterly pleased with the whole thing. So,
well, you have to realize that that's a professional chef's recipe. So he probably had some gopher in the kitchen doing that work for him, because it's not fun. However, I can solve your problem easily. Next time you do the stuffed artichokes, just get a grapefruit spoon with teeth on the end.
yeah, that sounds
like a cinch.
Tried to use a spoon,
Scoop it out.
a knife, a fork. I've been able to take it out if I cook them first, but then it's just once you get to the middle. I think they'll cooperate.
Just to satisfy my morbid curiosity, William, regarding the brain texture, Richard McVeigh weighs in on the chat asking, I hear brain textures like tapioca. Is that accurate?
Yes, or raw octopus. It's like chewing on, it's just, I don't know. It's soft. It could be gelatin. Well, I don't know. I did get a pig's brain, and I looked at it and I poked at it, but I didn't go beyond there. We're not supposed to eat brain anymore anyway, because of what? Some kind of mad cow disease or what have you. So that's fine by me.
Yeah, I don't think that's a massive concession.
No.
Laura Kime asked a question early on about the exhibition that you did back in 86, 87. And she asked, the planning must have been over many years. Is that accurate?
For the Larder Invaded? 83. I think it took us 2 years.
Wow. That's
Yes,
impressive that you managed to pull that together in 2 years, honestly.
it was fast forward, I'll tell you. Yes. Well, yes, it was about 2 years.
Wild. All right. Well, I'm very impressed. I mean, I did a small exhibition that Katie helped out on, and I think we spent about 8 months planning it. And it wasn't two organizations, it wasn't 1,000 items. So 2 years is very impressive, William.
No, as we found things, we would accession them, we would create a label and put it in a case. It was like that.
That's amazing.
And when we got to the end of it, we said, oh, okay, we're done. No more.
Yeah, you could just go on forever and ever doing that.
You can, absolutely.
All right. We have a question from Nick Buffone, who asks, isn't cochineal used in shellac for coloring?
It may very well be. I've never seen a recipe for shellac. I don't cook with it. So, but cochineal, it turns up in a lot of the recipes. For example, in the Quaker Woman's Cookbook, Elizabeth elegantly uses it to make her ice cream pink. So it was common.
We have a couple of comments in the chat thread from Hillary Heckman, who notes, going back to the brains, it's like soft cream cheese.
Okay, that's good. Hi, Hillary.
What a description. And then she also notes that with regards to your exhibition, William, a group of us went to the exhibit and liked it so much that we went to lunch and then went through the whole exhibit again.
Yes, there were people who did that.
Wouldn't want to go through that hungry.
Me neither.
Well, the exhibit makes you hungry if you look at all those menus.
Yeah,
Exactly right.
it's like grocery shopping hungry. I come home
Yes.
with 4 boxes of crackers and half the cheese case.
I'm glad I'm not the only one. Richard McVeigh asks, what is the difference in taste between red and white cabbage?
Red cabbage is spicier. It has a more peppery taste. White cabbages vary greatly depending on the variety. Some are sweet, some are very broccoli-like, cauliflower-like. It depends on the way they were raised. Also, a lot depends on the soil because the cabbage takes its flavor from the minerals in the soil. But the red cabbage is stronger tasting. So I think that's why it was more preferred for pickling, because that modified that spiciness in it.
All right. This is a really solid question that sort of opens this up a little bit. Denise Horner asks, what were the most common vegetables grown and eaten by middle-class families in the early 19th century?
Who's being asked?
Both
Me?
of you.
Oh.
Yeah. I guess first to you, Katie, did you see any recurring vegetables in the early 1800s recipes that you looked at?
Well, I realized after I was going through my recipes and choosing which ones to highlight in this lecture that I had somehow missed the first half of the 19th century. So I was trying to choose a variety, but cabbage did show up again when I was making pepper hash. I chose a lot of baking recipes as well. But I'm not sure I chose a great enough sample size to really tell you which vegetables were the most used by middle-class 19th century Philadelphia.
I would say this is one of the things that the Roughwood Seed Collection has focused on, is getting the seeds from that period, if we can still find them. But the kitchen garden as a large operating thing was basically an upper middle class idea. You needed a gardener to run it. I mean, so there's a whole dichotomy between what upper class people were growing in their magnificent kitchen gardens, which were status symbols in those days, as opposed to the poor person living up in the Northern Liberties who had, you know, a small plot of land. Basically, turnips, beets, cabbage for your root vegetables. Some people in Philadelphia grew tomatoes. And that reminds me that there was also a difference between the African American gardens and those of the non-African Americans. So we know a little bit about some of these ethnographic differences. Basically, if you go into Robert Bust's family kitchen gardener of the 1840s, 1848, he lists the basic vegetables that were being sold in that period. What was being sold doesn't necessarily indicate what's being bought, because your economic means was very much a determining factor. I know among the farmers in Chester County, only because I've interviewed people, most people ate parsnips. They ate parsnips until they came out your ears, because they were cheap. They grew well on the heavy clay soils of Chester County. So I think probably we have to take into consideration that word called terroir. What does the land allow you to produce? Whereas, let's say in southern Bucks County, where a lot of kitchen gardening was located, it's sandy, so you can grow lima beans and things of that sort much better there. It's very nuanced, that question about who was growing what. I've done some research on what was taken west on the Oregon Trail. I did that for the people out in Oregon, because seed boxes were put together by seed companies in Massachusetts that took everything you needed to plant a kitchen garden out there in Oregon. So that gives us an idea of what people were growing. But you need to look at almanacs, what the farmers read, because the almanacs make mention of foods, and that gives you a sense of what people are eating on a common basis. Of course, if you're Pennsylvania Dutch, sauerkraut 3 times a day. Cabbage.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't add that the library company has a prodigious collection of almanacs, and I invite all of you, when we are reopened for in-person researchers, to come in and explore that collection, because it really is vast and really a trove of great information. I think we're pretty much at time here, which is sad because there are some really great questions that we haven't quite gotten to, but I'm going to record them in a separate document so that they can help inspire future events. So thank you all for joining us on this journey, and thank you especially to Katie Maxwell and Dr. William Woys Weaver.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day, all.